Good evening, my fellow attendees. Here we are, New Year's Eve 1853. At the invite of Mr. Hawkins, who produced handwritten invitations to a select number of us attendees, 21, all picked for a variety of reasons, to marvel at his latest sculptures, dinosaurs. Now, so realistic and terrifying are they, one of the chefs dropped dead with shock. Hence, being the time perhaps a little lower down on the attendee list, I'm required to help cook one of tonight's dishes on our 8-course menu. That's not a menu, that's just the invite. 8 courses. And tonight, since we are dining in an iguanodon, I'll tell you a little bit about that as we progress, but since we're dining in iguanodon, it's nothing but the best. So tonight, I will be cooking Salmi de perdi. And if you think that's salmon, you're completely wrong. Our Salmi de perdi forms one of the entrees of the meal. Okay, and for that you're going to need 2 small partridges. Partridges are not available. You may use any other game hen, or in this case, chicken thighs. Now, if you're using a whole bird, then this stage is no different. We place it in a roasting pan, and we then lightly season the outside, and we have turned our oven on to 200, and we're now going to part roast the bird. We are not cooking it all the way through. This is going to cook for about 20 minutes. We want to like 3/4 cook it, because we will be cooking it in a sauce to finish it off, and we don't want to overcook it, particularly if you are using game bird, when it would get rather tough. So that's going to go in the oven. Before I do, so what's all this about? Well, the eminent artiste sculptor Hawkins set about to recreate dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were, when I say relatively new discovery, these were creatures that up until very, very recently no one had ever heard of. But their bones, their fossilised bones were found, and people began to piece them together, and dinosaurs came to be. I'm going to go on to that a little bit in a minute. But Hawkins, using the knowledge, particularly from Sir Richard Owen, talk about him later, he made what was believed to be lifelike representations, full size, of dinosaurs. And the largest that he made was the iguanodon. Hence the reason the meal was to be held, possibly, inside the iguanodon, not via the mouth, literally inside an opened up iguanodon, if you like. Anyway, and this was all part of the new Crystal Palace Park that was being built for the great exhibition. Okay, and this was a way of promoting his models, if you like. So like I say, this is going to go in the oven for 20 minutes, and then we're going to start preparing the sauce or gravy. To prepare the sauce, you're going to need a saucepan, some butter, about 3 to 4 shallots, 3 peeled carrots, about 3 to 4 mushrooms, some bouquet garnier, some cloves, some peppercorns, some beef stock, and then later the addition of some Madeira or sherry and sugar. So to commence, we're going to finely chop our shallots. Now, although we're cooking all this as part of the sauce, we will be removing the lumpy bits. So we're just chopping it fine, increase the surface area to help remove those flavours. So I was telling you about the Great Exhibition, and Hawkins realised that if he wanted to make a bit of money out of this, because it was going to be quite difficult otherwise, particularly because at a later date actually they removed the funding, and so many of the planned models never actually got made. He realised that if he could publicise this well enough, when the park opened, he could make money flogging models, things like this, which is what he did. So his select invite for this had to be quite small, because the intention was, like we said, they would dine in the Iguanodon. Now, here you can see a sketch of the Iguanodon, and you can see it's open back. Now, whether this is the part finished final thing, or whether this is the mould, or even whether actually some of them dined in the mould, some dined in the dinosaur, because there's not an awful lot of room in there for 21 people. Or even it may possibly be then none of them actually really properly dined in it. They dined at tables next to it. What we do know, it was in the big warehouse where all these models were. But it could be that they just dined right next door to it and all took turns to go and sit and perhaps have a drink or something in there. So the whole point of this was to bring in eminent palaeontologists. So at the head of the table was Sir Richard Owen, who I mentioned earlier, who was sort of partly instrumental in the design, or instructing him on the design of the dinosaurs. And actually there's 2 iguanodons at the park, and they're different. And they're different because the one they used for the dinner was the version that Richard Owen said it looked like. The other version, which he did eventually condescend to allow to be built, or made, cast, was actually from Gideon Mantle. Gideon Mantle is the scientist or paleontologist who actually discovered and named the Iguanodon, even though, as you will find out, Mr. Owen is rather naughty on that score. So I'm finally chopping my shallots and my carrots, and then we'll just get chopping the rest of the stuff we need, and then we can start making our sauce. And I can tell you some more. Right, so I've taken my mushrooms and I've sliced them. So in addition to Professor Sir Richard Owen, he invited, obviously, the chairman or managing director of the Crystal Palace, because obviously he was in a way like his patron. He also invited eminent sort of publishers, so the chief editor or publisher of the London Illustrated News and such like, knowing full well that he had his mixture of paleontologists, famous paleontologists, although with some notable sort of absentees, as it were, not because they didn't turn up, because they weren't bloody invited. And in one case it was a bit difficult to invite him because he died, but more on that sad story actually later. But he knew that this would get him the publicity, and it did. So the idea was to wine and dine them on, like I say, this 8-course meal. And what I'm doing, by the way, is you want a thick slice. Can't get a thick slice, so I've got 2 what Tesco's called thick, slices of ham, and it actually wants to be lean ham. This is coming from a Victorian recipe, which would obviously fit in with the right time scale, and in that Mrs. Beaton does specify quite specifically to use lean ham. Normally you add stuff like ham for the fat content, but we're not cooking it in the bacon fat. So let's have a look at our meat. Ooh, that's hot. Here's our meat. Right, now you can see there the meat is starting to brown, it's starting to cook. But what we're going to do now is just simply cover it over and put it to one side, because like I said, we will be finishing it off later. Almost touched that bastard then. Right, so essentially now I've got my ham chopped, we're ready to make our sauce, and we're now at that stage where the drinks have been flowing well, it gets all very boisterous, everybody's having a very good time, and I should point out, actually, it wasn't a particularly nice day, and about travel by London and then transfer by carriage or whatever to get to the warehouse, if you like, where it was. Everybody got dressed up, obviously, black tie event, but they were enjoying themselves, and it went on well past midnight, and various reports in the press the next day talked about how boisterous it was, and what it, you know, well, not really what happened, but towards the end of the evening, Richard Owen stood up to make the toasts. I hope he stepped forward a bit, because if he was sat under the head end and stood up, he'd fucking banged his head. So to my saucepan, I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of butter, and we're just going to melt that down gently. And then we're going to initially cook off our carrot and shallot. So anyway, I said Owen stood up at the table and to give various toasts, and one of which was to Gideon Mantle. Now Gideon Mantle, I think I mentioned, he was the one who wasn't invited, but that was simply because he had died about a year before. Now, as I said to you, Mantle is actually the guy who discovered and named the Iguanodon. However, Owen had been quite anti-Mantle, and at one point he claimed he was the discoverer, he was the one who found the Iguanodon and named it and everything. Yet at this dinner he stood up and toasted the memory of Gideon Algernon Mantle, and also acknowledged that he was the discoverer of the Iguanodon. Now this was like, woo! He suddenly totally changed track. He's now acknowledging Mantle as the discoverer. Now whether this was simply because he felt guilt or whatever, we don't really know. Weren't very nice about that. I mean, we're going to find out about him in a minute. Ironically, Mantle was buried not very far away, and I think it's in Norwood Cemetery, where, given that the racket they apparently was all making, he would probably heard that if he'd still been alive in his grave. But there you go. So this is you know, the evening finished with Owen doing all his toasts and acknowledging this other, and then 6 months later the park opens. I chuck all my shallots and carrots in there, and then, like I say, what we're going to do is just gently cook them through for about 5 minutes. Okay, so the park opens, 40,000 people turned up for the opening, and we're like, wow. Well, the Crystal Palace itself was an amazing building, but here were life-size replicas, although most of them are quite inaccurate nowadays. But at the time, you know, this was the first time people had seen these dinosaurs had started to be heard of. And, you know, there were sketches in the press, such as the replication of the one on Hawkins' handwritten invitation. But here were almost living, breathing dinosaurs that they could see and, you know, and wonder at the scale of these things. So it was an immense success. The whole Crystal Palace exhibition was an immense success. Hawkins made money from his, you know, merchandise, if you like, I suppose. It's like a modern day bloody concert, isn't it? The artist selling his merchandise, that's where he makes his money from. However, it wasn't long before it sort of went into decline. And then there was a fire. Excuse me, I think that's the dishwasher draining. And the Crystal Palace was destroyed. The models became sort of covered over with overgrown vegetation. But then over the years, I wouldn't say rediscovered, but they were then restored. At one point were moved slightly. That thing's making some noise, isn't it? And they were moved, and again, then they were given Grade 2 listed status. More recently, they then became Grade 1 listed status. And although it's generally accepted that most of the models that are still there aren't very accurate representations, you know, for what they were at the time, these were something quite astounding. And I said to you, there were 2 Iguanodon models, and you can still see the 2 today. The one, which is the one that reputedly was it was Owen's choice, and the one that reputedly they died in, was a rhinoceros-looking thing with a horn on its nose. Whereas Mantle, and this is why it be called an iguanodon, Mantle's view was that this thing was more like an actual iguana, albeit fucking what bigger. And so you've got the mammalian rhinoceros type Owen's view, and then you've got the reptile one with a tail and scaly and that, if you like, that was Mantle's view. And as it happens, they both weren't quite right, but Mantle was certainly a lot more accurate. So that's at just over 5 minutes. So at this point, we're now just going to add in that ham. Like I say, we're not after like getting the fat, hence it's lean. The sliced mushrooms. I've got about 3 or 4 cloves, 6 peppercorns, and then some bouquet garnet, which in the miraculous Victorian England comes in like a tea bag. In fact, actually I've got 2 because they're a bit small. And we're just going to, albeit the tea bags ain't going to do much in this at the moment, we're just going to cook that through for a couple of minutes. So I was saying to you about how Owen had, you know, praised Mantle. Less than a year before, I mean, Mantle died in November the year before, and literally weeks afterwards, like an obituary appeared in the paper anonymously, but strongly believed to have been written by Owen, pouring scorn on Mantle's work, basically saying he's nothing more than a collector of fossils that he hands over to the experts like myself. I mean, that's just one example of how he is, or was, because he did find that thing. And so, you know, having scorned him for a lot of his life, even scalding him after he died, he then suddenly has a about turn at this toast. In many ways, Owen, who was famous for a lot of things, became very possessive about dinosaurs. He was the guy who gave dinosaurs their name, Dinosaur. And he then sort of, oh, I'm obviously the dinosaur expert. No other fucker has any say in it. It's me. And that was one of the big reasons he was a little bit like he was towards Mantle. Not that that's an excuse, but he did feel that dinosaurs were his. Right, they've had a couple of minutes. Let's put the last lot, well, not the whole of the ingredients in, but let's get the next bit in. So, our next addition, now that's cooked for a little bit, is about 415 mils. That might seem an odd amount because the quantity was in cups, of beef stock, rich beef stock. Okay, so in that goes. We're just going to stir that in, and then we're going to let that come to a boil and then gently simmer away for at least half hour. Now, Mrs. Beaton, now I have to say, I was thinking about doing this, and once again, bloody Max Miller beat me to it. There's a very good reason why I wanted to do this, and it's because of the Iguanodon, and it's something you're going to find out in a minute. And he's using the Victorian, the recipe from the Victorian cookbook by Mrs. Beaton. But what it appears to be is that it's quite obvious that a lot of her recipes, apparently according to Max, she never actually tried out. She acquired these recipes, never tried them out. And so, for instance, she says we bring this to a gentle boil and then simmer it for 15 minutes. Well, that is hardly going to make a sauce. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that heat up just to bring it up to a boil. Well, you want to simmer this for at least half an hour. Okay, we certainly want it to start thickening. Now we've still got another little bit of prep to do, and we also still got to put a sugar and a Madeira in it. But at this stage, all we want to do is cook through our sauce. So just to finish off talking about how, in a way, how nasty Owen was towards Mantle. When Mantle died, I'm going to tell you about Mantle in a minute, and this starts to bring us into the connection as to why I wanted to do this story. But Mantle spent a lot of his last years in a lot of pain. And at this point, I think someone's about to come through the door, so I better just pause. So, as I was saying, before the wife came home, that's the story. We're not going anywhere with that one. But anyway, I was telling you that Mantle, in the last years of his life, was in an awful lot of pain. And after he died, there was a post-mortem, and he was shown to have scoliosis, curvature of the spine, and this was probably what caused him a lot of pain. So Owen thought it would be appropriate to preserve part of his spine in the Hunterian Museum, which he was sort of like a curator of. Excuse me. And so therefore he had part of his spine removed and put on show in the Hunterian Museum. Quite why, who on earth knows, but there you go. Actually the spine isn't there anymore, simply because World War II bombing raids, just like it did actually in quite a lot of ancestral records and that, fires as a result of bombing, Mantle's spine sort of was destroyed in that. But quite why anybody would want to put Mantle's spine on show just simply because he had scoliosis and it was Mantle windows. But anyway, right, so this is now just sort of coming up to the boil. So like I say, we're going to let this boil for about half an hour. And I'm going to have to get another beverage. I'm not really being into keeping with the theme. Tiny Rebel actually. Oh, Tiny Rebel have definitely got their app together. Normally I place an order, or you can place an order, Tiny Rebel. And it could be 2 or 3 weeks for me, like delivery, it turns out. They're doing it in a couple of days now. So I bought the wife some, and I just slip a few in there for me. And I've still got my Stay Puft from the last order I got. But I bought sort of a variety of fruitier ones that she might like. But I'm not quite sure which one I'm going for now. That was the electric boogaloo, which I've had before, which is alright. Right, so while that's sort of simmering away there, actually this is one of those I bought for the wife. And she goes, oh, how strong is it? It's like, well, just try it and you see what you like. It's a little peachy. And I thought, oh, she like that? It's peachy. How strong is it? It's 6.2. Oh, I might try one later. So I'm trying the other one that I've chilled down. So I don't think I've had this one before. I'm not sure if it's one of their birthday beers. I don't think it was. But actually I've already had it. It's not too citrusy, because some of their, their fruity beers are a bit citrusy. I would say it does taste peachy. It says it's peach smoothie. I suppose in a way it's a bit more like a peach smoothie than anything else. So just give this a little stir from time to time. Now we're going to serve this on croutons and with an accompaniment croutons. So you're going to want some thick slices of white bread. I've got a big cookie cutter here that's just about the right size, and I'm going to cut. You don't have to. You could be right heaving and just fry that. But that's rather uncouth, is it not? So I'm going to cut some big circles out of it, and we'll be frying them up in some butter later. Okay. So I mentioned Gideon Mantle several times. So who was Gideon Mantle? Well, he was born in 1790, February in 1790, in Lewes, Sussex. And actually, to be honest, he spent most of his life in Sussex. Although he did die in London at the age of 62, and like I say, in November, in the year before this big, well, I say big, there's only 21 people there, this big dinner. So he was obviously British because he was born in Britain. He was an obstetrician, that's a dishwasher, a geologist and a palaeontologist. By trade, obviously he was a doctor, that's how he made his money. But he is the one, like I say, who is credited with discovering and naming the Iguanodon. He also discovered and named other dinosaurs, particularly what was it, Ilosaurus or something like that. All right, I know you finished. And he became, and this is partly why Owen wasn't very happy, an expert in dinosaurs. So here he is, a doctor practicing his trade, but in his spare time doing a bit of fossil hunting in the area around Sussex and that. Looking at the chalk strata, he named one of the strata. What do we do? Bloody dishwasher. You know it's a new dishwasher because the other one. The Tilgate layer or strata after the local forest. I do believe that was another thing that Owen didn't like. But anyway, so that's who Mantle was. So anyway, I'm going to have to do a little tidy up here. Now you're going to still want some butter to do your croutons in, and you probably want a frying pan. I'm going to use a frying pan. And like I say, we've still got to put in our Madeira and our sugar yet. But this is I don't know if it's thickening, but it's certainly reducing down a little bit, extracting those flavours. So here we are, 1816. Oh, we're not. But I'm talking about, I'm going back in time, I'm talking about Victorian mantle. And he married Mary Ann Woodhouse. Now, she was only 20 at the time, which, although was obviously, by today's standards, adult, at that time, she wasn't considered old enough to get married. So it had to be sort of special agreement and everything, blah, blah, blah. She had to be 21. But he married her. He bought a practice in Lewes, Sussex, and also became appointed to the Royal Artillery as a like a physician. So at that point, everything's on the up for him. Now, around about this time, I'll say around about this time, earlier, Mary Anning, down in Dorset, had discovered this crocodile-like creature which turned out to be an ichthyosaur. And this obviously spurred a lot of people like Mantle to go, I was about to pick the bloody bread up then and drink that, to go looking for fossils, to see these creatures. So he kept studying his local area. Now, in Cuckfield in Sussex, he began to find, interestingly, not that this is any connection, but interestingly, our ancestors from around that area. But he discovered these large bones, or fossilised bones, larger than had been discovered before up in Oxfordshire by William Buckland, who was an eminent palaeontologist at the time. And he was also writing books. He started his first book about that time, and it was about that time he was out visiting a patient, and his wife had gone along, and she was a bit interested in looking at this stuff, and she spotted these sort of sparkly rocks in another rock by the side of the road, and they were these teeth. And so she sort of said to him, look, here's these large teeth. Or they certainly look like teeth. Now, it also turned out that exactly the same time, with the publication, it's a bit wowing now over this, again, we are in a heat wave in England. Again, my boss feels that apparently the aircon is not needed because the temperature should be kept at a constant 23 plus. The man's not right in the head. And anyway, he was planning his second book at this time. So he'd written his first book, his wife suddenly discovers his teeth, he's planning his second book, and then he gets this letter from King George IV saying, basically, make sure you put me on the subscription list for your book. I am very, very interested. But this is like, whoa, the King's interested in what I'm doing. Get out there and do some more. So he goes looking for other things, but also because of these teeth his wife had found, he was sort of like interested to know exactly what they were. So he went to Cuvier, who was an eminent French anatomist, and said, what do you think to these? And he said, they are rhinoceros. So Mantle was a bit pissed off, a bit annoyed, like, oh, £40 ain't quite interesting. Now, as it happened, he asked Cuvier at a bit of a wrong time. He was partying at the time, and the next morning he wakes up feeling a little worse for wear and thinks to himself, actually, I think I may have been a bit rash in that decision. I don't think they are. I don't know what they are. And he told some of his colleagues, but unfortunately, that never got back to Mantle. So back home in England, everybody's saying, rhinoceros teeth. Nothing special, you twat. So Mantle never realised that actually Cuvier was beginning to say, hang on, you might have something new here. When you start you add in the stock and everything, if you actually use the whole bird and you've chopped off the breasts and the wings and the legs and you've got the meat off, chuck the bones in there. A bit like if you're making a stock to get the extra flavour. So, like I said, that's coming up to the end of about half hour or 35 minutes of boil. So we're going to strain it and we're going to let it cool slightly because we want to remove any of the fat. Now there possibly ain't going to be a lot of fat because obviously we haven't put the carcass in there. And also I've now switched back to my staple staple. So going back to these teeth, even though he'd been rejected, Mantle was convinced, even though everybody else had taken the piss out of him, that they were not rhinoceros. And then he sort of realised the shape and structure of them resembled the iguana. And he became convinced that they were related to the iguana, albeit these fossils were from a giant iguana-like creature. Again, people still take the piss out of him, didn't believe him, and he then tried to argue, looking at the rock strata, they come from the Mesozoic era. Now, at the time, there was an eminent sort of geologist, paleontologist, William Buckland, who had done a lot of work on sort of strata and stuff like that, and he pulled scorn on it, and he said they don't come from that region. Don't know what we're talking about. However, in 1825, Mantle was proved correct. These were from this ancient layer, and they were indeed from an iguana type dinosaur. Now, by this point, there'd been more discoveries, sort of by Mantle. We'll come into that. I'm here by getting into the link of why I'm interested in this. But this is then when he realised this was a species of dinosaur that had never been found, and because it was related, or because it looked like it might be from related to iguana, he wanted to call it an Iguanosaurus. Now, a famous sort of taxonomist, paleontologist or whatever, Beer, who was actually one of those who was not actually at the dinner, but I don't think he was anyway, but he had a banner up with his name on it, some like Buckland and all that. They had banners around the room. Mary Annin, who I mentioned earlier, she didn't get mentioned. She's a woman, she can't get mentioned, can she? Beer, again, came back to him and said, well, I quite like the idea, obviously you're naming it to do with the Iguanodon, but, sorry, I've been eating. But he said, I think the name Iguanosaurus, too much. Right, that's basically saying that's had at least 35 minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to strain that into there. But what he was saying was he felt that by naming it that, it would cause confusion because it was too close to the actual Iguanodon species that currently existed. And therefore he felt he should modify his choice of name, and because it was related to the Iguanodon's teeth, he suggested, one of his suggestions was, why don't you call it an Iguanodon, to do with the teeth of the iguana. And that's what Mantle decided to use, and that's why now today we refer to it as the Iguanodon. Now, as it happens, there's been various different species of Iguanodon discovered. All I'm just trying to do at the moment is just get as much of that liquid out as possible. And in fact, the name that was given to the one that Mantle, which we haven't mentioned yet, actually in a way discovered, has actually been recently renamed, and I think it's actually been renamed to include mantle in its name. I'm just going to put that down there because I'm going to make a mess of it. But that's how the Iguanodon got its name. And like I say, he also went on to discover a different species of dinosaur and name that as well, and that's what made a lot of people say Mantle is a dinosaur expert. Pissed off having no end. Well, very little fat on that. I've removed a little bit. Here's our chicken. I did actually remove it and drain it because, as typical, a lot of bloody moisture in our chicken. So what we do now is we're just pouring over that sauce, and we're also going to add a tablespoon of sherry and of sugar and 60 mils of sherry. Oops. He says smashing the bloody thing. And now what I'm going to do is just bring that to a very low simmer. Okay, and we do want to cook it very, very gently. Given the pan I'm using, I may need to turn the meat over to make sure it all cooks. But we're now going to finish off the cooking of the meat. And while the meat's finishing cooking, I'm going to finish off telling you my story about Mantle. So, Mantle started to get recognition, for, for these Iguanodon discoveries and everything else. In 1833, he relocated to Brighton, but unfortunately his medical practice was starting to suffer, and he was losing money. He almost became destitute. He tried renting his house out as a museum, and it was exceptionally popular. He used to give talks about his discoveries and some of his exhibits. Unfortunately, he was a bit too generous, and he used to let a lot of people in for nothing, which would sort of defeat the object, really. And so he didn't help. So eventually he moved to Clapham in South London and carried on working as a doctor. So he carried on doing that for a few more years, but unfortunately, 1839, his wife left him. I've got a feeling I've read. There's a book you can read about dinosaur hunters. It's been a long time since I read it, but I've got a feeling they may well have lost a child, and that's really what ended up being the breaking point. But anyway, she left him, and then shortly afterwards, his son Walter emigrated to New Zealand. As it happened, his son used to send him finds of fossils from New Zealand, knowing full well that his father would be interested in them. But he was left with a daughter, Hannah, but she was a bit of a sickly child, and she died in 1840. So he was pretty distraught. In 1841, he began to get a lot of problems, a very painful condition, which was later diagnosed as scoliosis, curvature of the spine. He had been involved not long beforehand in a carriage accident where he'd been sort of knocked down and run over by a carriage. And whether this is what precipitated this, we don't really know for sure. But it ended up causing him immense pain. So remember, this is 1841 when he's diagnosed as having this spinal curvature. And from then onwards, he was in constant pain. He carried on writing books, he carried on writing scientific papers. He carried on trying to do all his work. In 1841, he moved to Pimlico. And sort of within a year, he started taking opium as a painkiller. So this is 1841. On 10th of November 1852, it appears that he finally couldn't take it anymore, and he overdosed on the opium and died. Now, speculation at the time, was it deliberate? Was it just an accident? it does appear that it may well have been deliberate. He just couldn't. I mean, he'd lost all his family. His wife wasn't with him anymore. His son had moved. His youngest daughter, he idolised, had died. He's in immense pain. And that's possibly one of the things they talked about at the dinner. Did he really commit suicide? But anyway, he took this overdose, lapsed into coma in the afternoon, and by the evening he was dead. At that point, he had been credited with identifying and naming 4 of the 5 genera of dinosaurs. Another reason why Homer's so pissed off with him. So, like I say, what we're doing now, it still hasn't come up to the boil yet, but we're going to bring this up to the boil and we're just going to let this then cook away. Like I say, I'm going to turn the meat in a bit and we're just going to let this slowly cook until the meat is cooked through, at which point we'll be ready to serve. Well, before then, of course, we've got to cook our croutons. And I've also got to tell you 2 more stories. One is a little bit about Richard Owen, bastard. And the one is about the Iguanodon that that Mantle sort of discovered. He certainly identified it. So that's simmering away. I've moved it on the back burner. We've now got a frying pan there. And now I'm going to add some butter. See how hot it is now, how soft that has become. I'll add some butters there, and what we're going to do is we're going to cook our croutons. So, and that was Mantle. So, who was this Richard Owen, Professor Owen? Well, he was born in 1804 in Lancaster. He died at the age of 88 in London. And it can't be denied, but he was a very eminent and important person. He was just a bit of a bastard. So, he was an anatomist, palaeontologist, a biologist. His reputation got to that point that he basically had first dibs on any of the animals that died at London Zoo. He was allowed to, take them animals and dissect them. And so he was able to, access the anatomy of all these animals that no one else ever got a chance to do. Stay Puff's going down, by the way. He did produce a vast amount of scientific information that is still important today. However, he's best known for the fact that he named it after some Greek words, the name for dinosaurs, dinosaura, meaning terrible lizard or reptile. And that's really what most people know him for. But, he was a very, very knowledgeable and eminent scientist. It's just like I say, some of the stuff he did wasn't necessarily his. And he was a bit of a bastard. Anyway, just going to put a couple of these in here. And we're just going to fry them off. And then brown them on both sides and flip them, obviously, to brown both sides. But he was a very controversial figure because he tended to disagree. If he felt it was wrong, whether everybody else thought it was right, if he thought it was wrong, he disagreed, and he did, like Mantle, he could crucify a lot of people. It could result in them, being, even though he just didn't like it. But he did make some other important discoveries. For instance, he found these fossilised footprints. He actually named the species of arthropod that made them, and it was 150 years before, well, after his death, obviously, before actually the species was discovered and shown to be the species he said it was. It was just simply his nature, really. He became the person to turn to. Hence the reason Hawkins asked him to give his opinion on what these dinosaurs looked like when he was, you know, making the moulds and designing these models. Because Owen was considered the dinosaur man. However, many of his contemporaries, including Darwin, Mantle, particularly Mantle, because obviously he was really nasty to Mantle, said he was malicious, dishonest and very hateful. An Oxford professor at the time said he was a damned liar. He lied for God and he lied for malice, just simply for the fact he enjoyed it. Some people said he was a sadist. He did these things because he enjoyed it. Mantle claimed it was a pity that a man so talented should be so dastardly and envious. Like I said, Mantle went on to discover the Iguanodon, things like that, and Owen didn't like that because I'm the king of the dinosaurs. He agreed with Darwin that things evolved, but told Darwin he far too simple, he didn't know what he was talking about, he got it all wrong. So even Darwin wasn't a fan of his. And an eminent sort of anatomist and palaeontologist at the time, Freeman, said, again, a bit like Mantle, he may well be a distinguished zoologist of invertebrates and such like, but he's the most deceitful and odious man. And then, really, the thing that I would say is crowning glory that got him like was the fact that he tried to take all the credit. He claimed that he and Cuvier were the two people who discovered the Iguanodon, identified it as this new species, named it, and everything. And there's even speculation, evidence that he managed to suppress the Royal Society from publishing some of Mantle's papers, simply because he hated him that much and didn't like the fact that Mantle got there first. I'm going to flip them over. I don't know if you can see them, they're not very brown. Just turn the heat up a bit. I'm going to cook them a bit more. So, he was not a nice bloke. But like I say, all this, the way he behaved, eventually it was his downfall, and the Royal Zoological Society chucked him out. Said, it's quite obvious a lot of his discoveries were plagiarism. He was taking the credit for other people's work. There you go, mate. So, that was Richard Owen. So our final thing in the story, which is partly, well, it's the main reason, to be honest, why we're doing this tonight, is the Iguanodon itself. The discovery of the first complete skeletons, or semi-complete skeletons, of the Iguanodon. So we've been mentioning Mantle, we've been mentioning the Iguanodon, and I keep telling you that there is a link as to why I wanted to do this. He mentioned how his wife Mary found Iguanodon teeth, but they were just teeth. If we go back to 1834, we're looking at a quarry in Maidstone, the county town of Kent, and owned by well, he was the owner, but he was also a amateur geologist and whatever, William Benstead. And in one of his quarries on the outskirts of Maidstone, in an area now known as Queen's Road, apparently purportedly on the site of the discovery of the Iguanodon is now this 20th century house known as the Dell, which did at one point have Iguanodon sort of statues on the gates, if you like, they got vandalised, so they're not there anymore. You know, typical today. Oh, let me just flip me Ujits. But in this quarry, in 1834, a bone was discovered. And Benstead was quite interested. He thought, oh, this is interesting. And then they started sort of digging out more, and they found a slab of bones. Now, Benstead himself was obviously very interested, being what his interests were. But at that time, people like Mantle were willing to pay money for fossils like that. And given that this appeared to be of a large creature, like nothing they've been seen before, I'm just going to turn that meat off now because that's reduced down quite a lot, that stock, or that sauce. Benstead got word to Mantle and he rushed down to have a look. And by then they'd excavated this slab that contained some bones, some leg bones, some vertebrae, a little bit of rib. And Mantle realised that these were other parts of this iguanodon that he had the teeth for. Not obviously the same bloody creature, completely different area. But he realised this was an iguanodon. And so he purchased, for the rather large sum of £25, the slab which is known today as the Maidstone slab. Now the Maidstone slab was purchased for the Natural History Museum, which was one of the things that Owen was instrumental in getting done. He said he felt that natural elements of what was in the British Museum should have their own museum. So Owen founded and was allowed to found the Natural History Museum. So the Natural History Museum that exists in South Kensington today for London, down to Owen. And in there now is the original, what was known as the Maidstone slab, or sometimes known as the mantelpiece. Maidstone Museum, the town in which it was discovered, has a scientific cast of that, so a replica if you like, but the original is now in the Natural History Museum. From that they were able to decipher that this was 6 to 10 metres long. At the hip it was just over 2 metres high, but this was assuming it walked on 4 legs. Now we know now today that some of the initial interpretations of how it was is slightly wrong. They were reptiles, and they basically roamed in the area of Kent, in swampy countryside, feeding off conifers and such like, but also in Belgium, Germany, North Africa, and even in the USA during the Cretaceous period. Right, so that's my other croutons finished. So I'm just going to get these sorted. I've got a little bit more to tell you about the Maidstone Iguanodon, but not a lot. So I've placed the meat on the croutons with a side accompanying croutons. Oh, that's how it's a bit warm. And what I'm now going to do is just put on some of that rich sauce over the top. Okay, it's not that thick, but then again there's not that much in there to thicken it with. So like I said about the Maidstone Iguanodon, it was a herbivore. Okay, seemed to be a two-legged, well, its forelimbs were shorter than its hind legs, so initially people felt that it obviously walked on back legs, but the general scientific thought now today is that it didn't. It walked on 4 legs. It may well have sat back on its other legs, but it was generally a 4-legged creature. Like I said, it was a herbivore, beak-like front teeth, these iguanodon-like, or guana, back teeth for chewing. That was the iguanodon that Mantle discovered, if you like. Actually, some people actually argue that it wasn't Mantle's wife who discovered the Iguanodon teeth. It was Mantle himself, but who knows? So let's try. I'm going to have to put that down. I'm going to make a bloody mess everywhere. Let's try a bit of our chicken. Partridge, shall I say? Partridge. With a bit of our sauce. And a little bit of crouton, which has soaked up some of that sauce. Today, Benstead's quarry isn't there. Up until about the 70s, parts of it still existed. Like I say, over the site of the original, apparently, discovery is now a house. That sauce is nice and rich. Chicken's a little bit, I wouldn't say a little bit tough, but it's not, to be honest. It's thigh. It's not overly cooked. It's cooked, but what I mean is overcooked. That sauce, superb. So, there you go. That's the story of Salmi de perdi, served on the New Year's Eve dinner in celebration of the models of dinosaurs, as they then believed them to be, at the Crystal Palace in 1852, 53, 54, I can't remember now. And the story of the Maidstone Iguanodon. And Maidstone is the only place that has a dinosaur on its coat of arms. There's the link.